Metal Sonic did not know what to do, at least not with any certainty. He hadn't known why Sonic started to sob, and he still didn't know now that Sonic had stopped. His confidence intervals had slowly been unraveling ever since Nega captured them, and this type of vague uncertainty had become the new normal. And yet, despite all that had happened, Metal could take some comfort in his confusion, because while it was true that he did not know, he at least now knew that he did not know. Further, Sonic's condition seemed to be improving. His chest rose and fell with a slow, yet steady pace, and his breath graced Metal's intake panel with the lightness of a feather. Taking care not to move him, Metal brought his fingers to Sonic's neck. Like his breathing, Sonic's pulse was steady, and his condition appeared stable. Metal knew of only one explanation. Sonic had fallen asleep. Which meant Metal now faced a dilemma. He hated to wake Sonic, for Sonic needed all the rest he could get. Nevertheless, the fact that Sonic had fallen asleep in his arms posed some practical limitations to his mobility. There were a few key tasks to finish, and Metal would have to accomplish them without waking Sonic. Which brought him to the soaked towel strapped to Sonic's back. It would do no good unless it was dry. Metal placed his hand over the cable, then slipped his fingers beneath the knot and slowly worked the cable free. He lifted the towel aside, water dripping to the floor, and wrung it out as much as he could. After shaking free the last droplets, he set the towel flat to dry. He pulled Sonic higher on his chest and leaned over his shoulder to look at the injury on Sonic's back. Just as he had hoped, a smooth silver patch had emerged over the wound. Although thin, it would block infection until Metal had the opportunity to replace the towel. Next was the problem of Sonic's shoe, which, like the towel, had been thoroughly soaked. It would not dry unless Metal removed it, so he bent down and placed his hand below Sonic's sole. He slit the shoe off, shook the water from it, and placed it aside. Fortunately, Sonic's robotic foot was nearly waterproof and would not require any immediate maintenance. Metal estimated Sonic would sleep for approximately 10 hours and 54 minutes, which would give him ample time to recharge and process delayed computation. He gingerly inched towards the janitorial closet, moving slowly enough not to stir Sonic, and plugged himself into the outlet in the corner. As he sat surrounded by the aging mop and buckets of cleaner, he looked down at his former rival sleeping in his arms. Not long ago, Sonic has been his single greatest enemy, the bane of his existence, and his loathsome copy. Now, Sonic was his most valuable ally in the fight against Nega. But he was also more than that, for he was the only person to ever show Metal any kindness. Through his entire existence, everyone, including Eggman, treated him like a mindless tool. He was nothing more than a weapon, a thing to be used. He had no goals, no desires of his own, and even Metal himself assumed such things were beyond him. And yet, after all that, despite everything he had done to Sonic, it was his greatest enemy that treated him like a genuine person. It took Sonic himself to show him that he could be more than a mindless copy. A single thought rose through his processors. At last, Metal finally understood what the mathematics tried to tell him earlier. As usual, the math was flawless, and he had been too irrational to understand what his models predicted. It was a mathematical fact that he could never kill Sonic the Hedgehog. He could never kill Sonic the Hedgehog because he did not want to kill Sonic the Hedgehog. He did not want to kill Sonic the Hedgehog because Sonic the Hedgehog was the only one who treated him with kindness. It was perfectly logical, and it was that simple. It had always been that simple. Metal's optics lit up. The logic spread through his systems, updating all of his models. His support vector machine, his decision tree, his Bayesian network, all of them returned the same conclusion. One that was so painfully obvious and mathematically correct that Metal was frankly embarrassed that he hadn't realized it sooner. Primary objective: neutralize Sonic the Hedgehog. There it was. His primary objective and his reason for existence. Every action he had taken was to fulfill this goal, but he had been wrong. He was missing critical data. Without wasting a single clock cycle, Metal quickly queried his natural language processor, neutralize, to render something ineffective or harmless by applying an opposite force or effect. Metal's processors clicked. That was it. That was the missing data. Nowhere in his primary objective did it say that he had to kill Sonic. On the contrary, he was to neutralize Sonic the Hedgehog. He was to render him harmless by applying the opposite force or effect. Metal clutched Sonic in his arms. He was so peaceful when he was asleep. Not at all like the dangerous menace to Eggman's ambitions that he usually was. Awake, he was dangerous. Asleep, he was harmless. Metal hugged Sonic closer, still taking care not to wake him, and leaned back into the wall. As he began to switch his systems offline, he felt everything come together. He still didn't know what he was supposed to do, but he figured he was closer now than ever before. 11 hours, 38 minutes, and 13 seconds. Sonic had slept for 11 hours, 38 minutes, and 13 seconds. Of course, Metal had finished his routine maintenance protocol and come online far earlier, but he hadn't moved. He needed to sit perfectly still until Sonic awoke. Sonic stirred. He squinted his eyes, then blinked. Metal noticed immediately and said, "Good morning, Sonic. Has your subjective well-being improved?" Sonic did not reply. Instead, he groaned and rubbed his forehead. So Metal added, "How do you feel?" Again, there was no reply. Sonic slowly peeled open his eyes. He paused with his forehead pressed against Metal's chest, then immediately rolled off Metal and onto the floor, where he continued to lay with his face in the dust. "I assume you need a moment to wake up. I will get you a drink," Metal said. As he walked outside the closet, he scooped up the bucket and strolled to the rushing water. He knelt by the ledge, filled the bucket, and then returned to the closet. Sonic still hadn't moved. "Here." Metal placed the bucket at Sonic's feet. Sonic continued to lay on the floor. "I know you were not asleep. You slept as long as you needed. Come on, drink this. It is healthy. You will need to keep up your strength." Metal knelt by Sonic's side. He brought the bucket up, but froze as he saw Sonic barely managing to hold back tears. "Look, I know how you feel." Metal placed his hand on Sonic's shoulder. "I have spent most of my existence ruminating over similar thoughts, but now is not the time. We need to get out of here, and you need your strength, so—" Sonic said nothing, but a single tear escaped and slid down his cheek. Metal set the bucket on the floor. He knew exactly the pain Sonic was in, and he had to help Sonic, no matter what it took. Not only because they would never escape if Sonic was this upset, but because he wouldn't wish that pain on his worst enemy, let alone his most valuable ally. If he was to help Sonic, he had to relate to him on his level, and Metal knew the best way to get through to him. "Hey Sonic, what do you call light water?" Sonic gaped at Metal and finally spoke. "What?" Metal stood up triumphantly. "Gluon free!" Sonic just stared at him, so Metal continued. "It is a joke. I told you the water is healthy. A common category of food people consider healthy is gluten-free. The gluon is a subatomic particle that holds matter together, so it's not present in light, hence the joke, gluon-free. It's funny because it is impossible." Sonic stared at Metal for a moment. A small smile cracked across his face. He laughed at first, but his voice grew louder until his laughter filled the whole closet. "That joke is terrible. I mean, it's wonderful, but it's also terrible." Sonic sighed, sat up, and brought the bucket to his lips. He took a single gulp. "Alright, as soon as we get the chance, we're going to work on your sense of humor." "Well, I thought it was flawless. Regardless, you did not answer my prior inquiry. How do you feel?" Sonic sighed and dropped the bucket to his side. "Physically, I feel fine, although my back is still a little sore." "I expected that," Metal said as he reached for the towel and the cable. "The nanites in your blood formed a scab across the wound, although they can only do so much. They can only recognize simple patterns and repair minor aberrations. It is your cells that will have to fully repair the wound, and they operate much more slowly. You won't get an infection, but your body still has to repair the muscle damage." Metal knelt behind Sonic and pressed the towel against his back. Sonic seemed to understand what he was doing, because he lifted his arms just enough for Metal to wrap the cable back in place. "You said you feel fine physically." Metal finished tightening the cable and stood up. Sonic's gloves had dried over the door, so Metal swept them into his hands and returned to Sonic's side. He dropped the gloves in Sonic's palms. "But how do you feel otherwise?" Sonic gazed at his gloves before dropping them on the floor. He looked away. "I'm fine, I guess. It's just, I don't feel like myself. No, that's not right. I'm not myself. My foot is magnetic, I drink chemicals, I failed to fix you, and I failed to free that Flicky." He buried his face in his hands. "I thought I was supposed to be Sonic the Hedgehog. Failure is not what I do, and yet I feel like failure is all I've accomplished here. It's not right. What happened to me? What am I anymore?" Metal pulled Sonic's hands away from his face. The red glow from his optics illuminated the emerald green in Sonic's eyes. I wish I had the answer to that. Truly I do, but I cannot tell you what you are. He took a glove from the floor and slid it over Sonic's hand. But I can tell you what you once told me. What are you? That is not for me to decide. Only you can answer that question. But I don't know the answer! That's the problem! Metal grasped Sonic's hand. Once I was like you. I thought every question had an answer. If I could only gather enough data, I would uncover the truth. But now I realize this is simply not true. There are questions we cannot answer. He slid the other glove over Sonic's hand. But there is hope. For at least we know that we do not know. You say you do not know what you are, but consider, you know that you do not know what you are. That is something. It is a sliver of knowledge, and it is a start. As Sonic looked down at his hands, Metal dropped his shoe into them. So I do not know what you are, nor do I know what I am. But there is one thing I do know. He leaned down and set his hand on Sonic's shoulder. I know that if we work together, we will escape. And if we escape, maybe, just maybe we will both find an answer. Sonic said nothing as he slipped the shoe on his foot. As he turned his head up, Metal offered him his hand. Slowly, Sonic placed his hand in Metal's palm, and Metal began to lift him to his feet. His hand lingered, but he quickly brushed his quills and looked away. You're right. It's not the answer I wanted to hear, but you're right. I suppose if it were that easy, we wouldn't be here, but... Sonic sighed. Thanks, Meds. For everything. You're a good friend. Metal's optics widened. We are... friends? Of course! You help me, and I help you. That's what friends do. We are... friends, Metal repeated. I've never had a friend before. Sonic opened his mouth to reply, but an ear-splitting screech, like that of a halting train, cut him off. The sound grew louder and louder, until it abruptly stopped just outside the door. It was followed by the rhythmic sounds of metallic footsteps treading towards them. Keep your voice down, Metal whispered. He grabbed the mop and shoved it into Sonic's hands. As Sonic merely stared at the handle, Metal stepped behind him. Placing his hands over Sonic's, he twisted the mop so the bristles blocked Sonic's face, then withdrew his hands to rest on Sonic's shoulders. Sonic had no time to respond as a dark silhouette moved to block what little light streamed in from outside. Metal leaned over and whispered into his ear. Act like a mop.